What if I told you that in the heart of America's most peaceful countryside, 4 sisters were said to have slaughtered their neighbors and buried them where no one would ever look? What if I told you the county itself kept the secret, not for years but for generations? You've heard the stories of witch trials. You've heard of Salem's hysteria. But this was no superstition. This was blood. This was real. The year was whispered, not written, 1837. The place? A farming village where everyone prayed to God, while 4 daughters made offerings of flesh to something else. Why was this story erased from maps, silenced in court records, and buried deeper than the bodies themselves? And if you knew the truth, would you ever look at a quiet farmhouse the same way again? The year was 1837, and Lancaster County lay spread across Pennsylvania like a patchwork quilt of farms, rolling fields, and quiet villages. At first glance, it was a picture of stability and God-fearing discipline, where bells rang on Sundays and wagons creaked along dirt paths, hauling crops to market. It was a time when the United States was still forming its identity, balancing the hope of expansion with the heavy shadows of poverty, superstition, and strict moral codes. For the people who lived there, daily life was bound tightly by faith and work. The dawn meant chores, and the setting sun meant prayer, with little space for indulgence or rebellion. Yet beneath this orderly rhythm there lingered a silence that did not feel holy. It was a silence where secrets could take root and fester, where whispers traveled faster than truth, and where families could carry darkness behind their shutters without interference from neighbors. In Lancaster County, religion was not just a practice. It was law, tradition, and judgment all at once. Many families were of German descent, carrying with them the old folkways of Europe, their dialects thick and their beliefs rooted in centuries of superstition. They built barns with hex signs, painted symbols meant to ward off evil, and whispered about charms that could cure sickness or shield against curses. Though they read their Bibles and quoted scripture, there was always an undertone of fear, that the devil walked close, just beyond the edge of the fields, waiting for an unguarded moment to slip into a household. Superstition mixed with faith until the two were indistinguishable, creating a culture where the unknown was not questioned aloud. People preferred to turn their heads, to pretend they had not seen, to pray away their doubts rather than invite scandal. It was in this atmosphere that the Miller family lived, their farmhouse perched on a stretch of land not far from the county's wooded ravines. Their neighbors described them as hardworking but strange, quick to avoid visitors and quicker still to let their doors shut firmly at nightfall. The father was remembered as a severe man, sharp-eyed and unyielding, who demanded obedience from his daughters as though they were soldiers rather than children. Discipline was not a matter of words, but of action, and there were rumors, unproven, never spoken to loudly, of screams that echoed from the house long after the lamps should have been extinguished. The mother was rarely seen, and when she was, she appeared frail, her voice soft to the point of disappearing. The daughters grew in this environment of severity and restraint, molded not by kindness, but by something colder. The county itself reinforced such strictness. Girls were raised to be modest, to marry early, and to obey without question. To stray from that path meant ridicule or worse, isolation. And yet the Miller sisters did not follow the expected script. Margaret, Anne, Sarah, and Eliza, 4 names that would one day drip with infamy, walked a different road. As they came of age, they neither sought husbands nor welcomed the attention of suitors. They lived together, always together, rarely apart, even for an afternoon. To the outside world, this might have seemed an act of devotion, 4 sisters bound by blood and duty. But to those who observed more closely, it carried an air of unease. Women were not meant to reject the world so completely. Women were not meant to form a closed circle, speaking in murmurs that carried no warmth. The year 1837 was itself a time of instability. Economic turmoil spread through the country as banks collapsed and businesses faltered. Poverty deepened, and with poverty came desperation. For Lancaster County's farmers, this meant lean harvests and empty markets. Travelers grew more common along the rural roads, men selling their labor for food, peddlers pushing carts of wares, widows wandering in search of shelter. This steady movement of strangers brought opportunities, for charity, for commerce, but also for exploitation. A missing man here, a vanished traveler there, could easily be dismissed in a world where movement was constant and records were scarce. And so the land provided not just cover for crops, but cover for secrets. The geography of Lancaster itself played its part. The fields stretched wide, but so too did the forests, with ravines and streams that cut through the earth like hidden scars. Barns stood isolated, often a half-mile or more from the nearest neighbor, meaning cries could be muffled, deeds could be done in silence, and blood could sink into soil unseen. It was a place where people minded their own affairs, not out of malice, but from the belief that meddling brought curses. A family's business was its own, whether it was prosperity, tragedy, or sin. Into this soil, the Miller sisters planted their lives. Their farm stood on ground their ancestors had cleared, tilled, and defended. That same soil, rich and dark, would later be whispered to hold more than wheat and corn. But in 1837, no one could have predicted just how the land would betray its keepers, or how its silence would become complicit in a series of crimes so dark that even the mention of them risked breaking the fragile order of the county. What made Lancaster particularly vulnerable was the very virtue it prized most: community silence. When something did not fit the accepted pattern, when a girl refused marriage, when a widow vanished, when a hired hand never returned from work, it was easier to invent a tidy story than to confront the possibility of evil. The Miller sisters understood this silence, lived within it, and eventually learned to exploit it. In a county where men worked with plows and women worked with prayer, no one could imagine four sisters turning that quiet discipline into something predatory. No one could imagine the prayers were not prayers at all, but perhaps oaths to something darker. As the year stretched on, Lancaster County remained unchanged in its routines. The church bells tolled, farmers harvested, mothers raised children, and travelers came and went. But in one farmhouse, hidden beneath the rituals of daily life, a different order was taking shape. One where silence was not just a social norm but a weapon. One where the absence of questions became the shield that allowed deeds to fester. The county, in its devotion to purity and order, had built a perfect cover for what would become one of the most chilling stories never meant to be told. It is easy to imagine Lancaster in those days as a place of sunlit fields, the smell of fresh bread from wood-fired ovens, and the laughter of children running barefoot along the roads. But it was also a place of long shadows, where barns loomed like silent witnesses and forests concealed more than game. It was a place where the year 1837 would not be remembered for its harvest, but for what it allowed to grow unchecked, a darkness rooted not just in the Miller farm, but in the very fabric of the community that refused to see what was happening in plain sight. The four sisters of Lancaster County were born into a house that never allowed softness. Their childhood was framed by the stern gaze of a father who believed discipline was the only virtue that mattered, and by the fragile presence of a mother who seemed more shadow than flesh. Margaret, the eldest, carried the weight of expectation from the start. She was tall, unsmiling, and carried herself with the stiffness of someone who had never been permitted to laugh freely. Anne followed closely behind, sharper in her features and sharper still in her tongue, known among neighbors for a glance that could silence even the boldest child. Sarah was quieter, withdrawn, her eyes fixed often on the floor as though she lived in a world entirely separate from the one around her. And then there was Eliza, the youngest, who should have been the most carefree but who instead mirrored her sister's severity, learning quickly that playfulness had no place under her father's roof. Their lives unfolded within the confines of the Miller farmhouse, a place where time seemed to slow and grow heavy. The rooms were dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves of scripture and old German prayer books, many of them filled with notes written in a hand no one outside the family could read. Candles burned low, meals were eaten in silence, and every hour of the day was accounted for with chores. The daughters rose before the sun, worked the fields alongside hired hands, mended clothes until their fingers bled, and were expected to kneel in prayer before bed until sleep threatened to claim them where they knelt. Any sign of resistance was met with the switch or worse, a punishment delivered in ways that neighbors suspected but never dared confirm. To the county, the sisters appeared as oddities. While other young women their age attended church socials, met with suitors, and looked toward marriage, the Miller daughters remained on the farm, withdrawn from the world. No courting carriages stopped at their gate. No young men lingered with gifts of flowers or letters. Some whispered that the father forbade it. unwilling to give up control of his daughters. Others suggested the sisters themselves refused, bound together in a loyalty that outsiders could not penetrate. Whatever the truth, the four remained unmarried, an anomaly in a place where women were expected to wed young or risk being branded spinsters. Their manner unsettled people. When they attended Sunday service, they sat side by side, stiff and motionless, never joining in hymns, their hands clasped so tightly that their knuckles whitened. While other women exchanged greetings after sermons, the Miller sisters walked out together, heads down, speaking to no one. They seemed to exist in a world apart, a silent unit bound by something stronger than familial love, something that looked, to those who dared observe closely, like a secret pact. The more they withdrew, the more rumors bloomed around them. Farmers spoke of seeing the sisters working by lantern light long past midnight. A child once claimed she saw them gathered at the edge of the woods, whispering to each other in voices too low to be understood. Others insisted the sisters were simply eccentric, the result of a harsh upbringing and isolation. But beneath these rationalizations, fear lingered. Margaret, as the eldest, acted as the figurehead. She controlled the household with the same severity as her father, her word law among the younger sisters. Anne was the enforcer, quick to lash out with cutting remarks and unflinching when strength was needed. Sarah remained elusive, her silence unnerving, her presence described as ghostly by those who caught her staring too long. And Eliza, though youngest, carried a cruelty that shocked those who encountered it. A neighbor once recalled how she twisted the neck of a bird with such casual detachment that he found himself shivering though the day was warm. Together they created a hierarchy, a private order where each played a role and none defied the other. The county's expectations of womanhood, docile, obedient, subservient, seemed to warp in the sisters' hands. They embodied obedience, but it was not the meekness of ordinary women. It was a controlled, sharpened obedience, one that bent inward and created a fortress around them. Their loyalty to each other replaced the bonds that should have connected them to the wider community. They shared glances that spoke louder than words, movements synchronized in ways that unsettled even those accustomed to family closeness. It was said that one could begin a sentence and another would finish it without hesitation, their thoughts wound together as if by design. Beneath this unity lay the scars of their upbringing. Whispers of beatings, of punishments carried out in the barn, of nights spent locked in dark rooms. Neighbors caught glimpses of bruises, or so they claimed, and some swore they heard the father's rage carried on the wind. If such stories were true, the sisters grew not in love but in survival, bound together against a common oppressor. Yet as they aged and the father weakened, the cruelty did not fade. Instead, it seemed to turn outward, redirected from themselves to the world around them. Isolation amplified this transformation. With no husbands, no children, no community ties, their lives became an echo chamber. They spoke only to one another, reinforced only by each other's beliefs and grievances. They recalled slights from neighbors with venom, remembered insults with a clarity that suggested they nurtured grudges like seeds. Their shared solitude gave birth to a dangerous intimacy, a collective identity where individual conscience dissolved. If one sister envisioned a cruelty, the others seemed to adopt it, refine it, and carry it forward as though it were inevitable. Their farm became both fortress and prison. The windows were often shuttered even in daylight, and visitors rarely crossed the threshold. Those who did spoke of the oppressive stillness inside, the way the air seemed heavy, the silence absolute except for the occasional creak of old wood. There were strange details, a pot simmering though no meal was served, books with unfamiliar symbols scrawled in margins, small objects arranged in patterns that made little sense. No one dared ask questions. To question was to invite suspicion, and suspicion in a county steeped in superstition was a dangerous thing. The Miller sisters' reputation grew not through acts witnessed openly, but through the accumulation of unease. A traveler who stayed the night at their farm never returned to the road. A farmhand vanished after a quarrel with Anne. A widow who argued over a boundary line disappeared without explanation. Each incident was explained away. Men wandered, widows relocated, workers abandoned their posts. But the patterns gnawed at the edges of the community's consciousness. They began to notice how the sisters thrived despite hardship, how their farm never seemed to suffer the misfortunes that plagued others. Some whispered that they had bargained for protection. that their unity was not only of blood, but of something more sinister. The sisters' lives, shaped by isolation, strict discipline, and secrecy, were unlike any others in Lancaster County. They were not merely women who refused to follow the path laid before them. They were women who carved out their own together, and in doing so, created a force that unsettled everyone who drew near. Their story would not be remembered for their prayers, their crops, or their silence, but for the way that silence became the mask behind which darker things took shape. The first crime attributed to the Miller sisters began almost invisibly, as though the county itself had conspired to bury it under silence. Caleb Renshaw was not a man of wealth or standing. He was a farmhand, young and strong, hired by the Millers to manage their fields during the planting season. Like many men of his kind, he moved from farm to farm, trading his labor for wages, food, and a place to sleep. No one thought much of his arrival. Lancaster County was filled with such drifters, men searching for a chance at stability in uncertain times. Caleb was different only in that he was remembered as hardworking, polite, and possessed of a restless energy that carried him from one task to the next without complaint. The day before his disappearance, Caleb had been paid in full. He told a fellow worker that he planned to head east in search of land to settle. The Millers, he said, had been fair but distant. He intended to leave in the morning, traveling light with his wages in his pocket. Yet when the sun rose, his boots were found still standing neatly by the door of the loft where he slept. His bed was made, the blanket smoothed with the care of someone who did not expect to return. His belongings, few though they were, remained untouched. Only Caleb was missing. At first, the absence raised little alarm. Men disappeared all the time, wandering off in pursuit of opportunity, or carried away by debts they dared not speak of. A week passed before the whispers began, sparked by small, unsettling discoveries. A neighbor boy who played near the Miller barn swore he had seen dark stains in the straw, stains that looked suspiciously like blood. Another claimed that on the night Caleb vanished, he saw smoke rising from the Miller's chimney long after midnight, the air carrying with it the acrid smell of burning cloth. When questioned, Margaret Miller, the eldest sister, offered a calm explanation. Caleb had taken his pay and gone. He left in the night to seek work elsewhere, perhaps ashamed of leaving without farewell. Her words were spoken without hesitation, and in a county accustomed to trusting appearances, most were willing to accept them. Still, doubt lingered. There were too many loose ends, too many details that resisted neat closure. Why would a man preparing for travel leave behind his boots? Why would he abandon his tools, the very instruments of his livelihood? Why had no one seen him on the road, no trace of him on the paths that threaded eastward out of the county? Suspicion settled like a fog, but it remained unspoken in public. In Lancaster, accusations were dangerous. To accuse was to risk becoming a target of gossip, or worse, of divine judgment for bearing false witness. People whispered in kitchens and barns, never in the open. They exchanged glances at church, careful not to let their words be overheard. The sisters carried on as though nothing had changed, their expressions unreadable, their routines uninterrupted. If they felt the weight of suspicion, they did not show it. It was the animals that deepened unease. Farmers reported that their dogs, when brought near the Miller property, grew agitated, barking and growling without clear cause. Horses balked at the road leading past the farmhouse, refusing to move forward until whipped or coaxed with unusual effort. Even the crows, ever present in the fields, seemed to circle the Miller barn more often than elsewhere, their cries harsh and unrelenting. To a community steeped in superstition, these were not coincidences. They were signs. Yet without a body there could be no crime. Without evidence there could be no justice. And so Caleb's name slipped into silence, carried only in murmurs among those who remembered him. His disappearance became a cautionary tale, a story told in hushed tones to warn of the dangers of trusting too much in strangers or in families who kept too tightly to themselves. For the Millers, it was as though the incident had never happened. They continued their work, their farm untroubled, their lives unchanged. The truth, whispered decades later, suggested otherwise. Some claimed that Caleb had been seen entering the barn on the night of his disappearance, drawn there by the promise of food or conversation. Others swore that the sisters lured him with drink, their voices unusually warm, their smiles uncharacteristically soft. Whatever transpired inside those wooden walls, he did not walk out again. Instead, the barn became the setting of his final moments. Stories differed. Some spoke of an axe, others of poison slipped into ale. A few insisted the sisters worked together, holding him down, silencing his cries before he could alert the neighbors. What became of his body was another mystery. The ravine behind the farmhouse, overgrown with brush and shadowed by trees, was said to conceal shallow graves. Some believed Caleb was buried there, beneath earth freshly turned, marked only by stones that looked like natural formations to untrained eyes. Others argued that his body was destroyed entirely, fed to pigs, or burned in the fire that neighbors swore smoldered late into the night. Each version carried its own horror, and none could be proven. The county's silence became complicity. By choosing not to investigate too deeply, by accepting the sisters' explanation without pressing further, the community allowed the first crime to vanish into rumor. This silence created a dangerous precedent. It told the sisters that they could act without consequence, that their unity and the county's reluctance to confront them would shield them. What began as a single disappearance soon grew into a pattern, one that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Looking back, Caleb's absence was the beginning of the unraveling. It marked the moment when suspicion first crept into Lancaster, when the Miller sisters shifted from objects of unease to subjects of fear. Before Caleb, they were strange but harmless, 4 unmarried women living apart. After Caleb, they became something else, women around whom shadows gathered, whose every gesture carried the weight of unspoken dread. The silence of 1837 did not erase the crime. It amplified it, turning the unanswered questions into an echo that haunted the county for years to come. Neighbors carried that unease in their hearts, though most tried to bury it beneath routine. When they passed the Miller farm, they walked a little faster. When they saw the sisters in church, they averted their eyes. And when they heard the faint sound of shovels in the night, carried on the wind from the direction of the ravine, they told themselves it was only their imagination. It was easier to believe in imagination than to face the truth, that something dark had already begun, and that Caleb Renshaw's disappearance was only the first chapter in a story Lancaster County would try, and fail, to forget. As months turned into years, the vanishing of Caleb Renshaw was spoken of less and less, yet his absence lingered like a shadow. It was as if the land itself had swallowed him whole, and the community, bound by fear and superstition, chose to accept that explanation rather than probe further. But the pattern that followed proved too chilling to ignore, even if the county worked desperately to look away. The Miller sisters, once considered strange but harmless, began to exist at the center of a growing ring of disappearances that could not be explained by chance alone. The next to vanish was a traveling peddler. He was a familiar type, one of countless men who roamed the dirt roads with carts filled with buttons, fabric, knives, and trinkets, exchanging goods for coins or food. Witnesses remembered him passing through a neighboring village, whistling as he pushed his cart, his voice carrying into the dusk. He was last seen heading in the direction of the Miller farm. After that, nothing. His cart was found days later, abandoned by the roadside, its contents scattered, as though emptied in haste. Some whispered that the sisters lured him in with promises of a hot meal and shelter for the night, and that he never saw the morning. Others believed he argued with them, that a dispute over payment or insult turned violent. The details shifted in each retelling, but the conclusion remained the same. The peddler disappeared, and the sisters were the last ones to see him. Then came the widow, an older woman who lived alone on a neighboring plot of land. She was known to be stubborn, quick to quarrel over boundaries and fences. It was no secret that she had fought bitterly with the Millers over a strip of pasture where the property lines blurred. Neighbors recalled heated words exchanged across fence posts, her voice shrill and unyielding against Margaret's cold defiance. One morning the widow was gone. Her door stood ajar, her belongings left in place, as though she had simply stepped out and never returned. For weeks her disappearance was whispered about, but the county offered no resolution. Some said she had fled to live with distant kin. Others claimed she had been taken by illness and buried quietly by strangers. But the more daring whispered another possibility, that the sisters had silenced her, removing the obstacle to their claim on the land. Each disappearance deepened the unease. A farm boy sent to deliver grain never came home. A traveling preacher, remembered for warning the sisters of their sinful ways, was last seen walking along the road that cut past their farmhouse. In each case, the sisters' names emerged, not from direct evidence, but from the gnawing certainty that they hovered at the edges of every vanishing. The county's silence grew heavier with each incident. Fear rooted itself so deeply that people no longer asked questions aloud. What unsettled the community most was the absence of visible struggle. No broken doors, no overturned wagons, no trails of blood that led into the woods. Those who vanished seemed to evaporate, erased as cleanly as chalk from a slate. This lack of evidence became its own kind of horror. The Miller sisters, always together, always silent, were suspected of crimes no one could prove. Their farm became a place of whispered avoidance. Children were warned not to stray near it. Men traveling alone chose longer routes to avoid passing their land at dusk. Some neighbors spoke of seeing lanterns flickering in the ravine behind the Miller property long past midnight, lights moving in strange patterns as if marking rituals. Others swore they heard the sound of shovels striking earth, followed by muffled voices, the cadence of chanting that did not resemble any prayer they knew. Those who lived close claimed the air carried the stench of decay when the wind shifted eastward, though no animal corpses were ever found. Such whispers spread, each one darker than the last, but still no one dared act. To confront the sisters meant standing alone against them, and few were willing to risk it. The county's reluctance to acknowledge the pattern only deepened the mystery. Officials dismissed the disappearances as coincidence. Men wandered, women fled hardship, and travelers often moved on without farewell. That was the official explanation, one repeated until it sounded like truth. But truth and fear do not sit easily together. Deep down, the people of Lancaster knew better. They saw the way the sisters carried themselves in public, unsmiling, watchful, bound together so tightly they seemed more like one entity than four individuals. They remembered the way their father had ruled the household, the way his severity had seeped into his daughter's bones. And they felt, though they would not say it, that these women were capable of deeds the county could not afford to name. The silence of the people became the sisters' shield. Each vanished soul strengthened their confidence, convincing them that no one would challenge them, that no one dared. Margaret's cold authority only grew. Anne's sharpness became more biting, Sarah's silence more impenetrable, and Eliza's cruelty more pronounced. They moved like a unit, rehearsed and unwavering, their bond unshaken even under the growing cloud of suspicion. Where others might have fractured under scrutiny, they seemed to draw power from it, their unity hardening like iron. And so the pattern of murder continued, hidden beneath layers of denial and fear. The sisters learned that the county itself would cover for them, not by intention, but through its refusal to act. Every missing man, every absent woman, was explained away by those too frightened to speak the truth. The more the sisters acted, the more the community buried its own unease, until Lancaster became not just the setting of their crimes, but the accomplice to them. Over time, the stories spread beyond Lancaster's borders. Travelers carried whispers of the four sisters who brought death to those who crossed their path. Some said the Millers poisoned men who threatened to leave them. Others claimed they practiced rituals, offering blood sacrifices to a force older than Christianity, something carried over from their German ancestors. There were even tales that they preserved bones, keeping fragments as tokens hidden in the walls of their farmhouse. Whether these accounts were exaggerations or rooted in fact, they painted a picture too grotesque to ignore. The sisters, once merely strange, had become legends of fear, and legends often grow from kernels of truth. The county, meanwhile, lived with the knowledge it refused to confront. People lowered their eyes when passing the sisters at church. They crossed themselves when they heard the crows that seemed to linger near the Miller property. They locked their doors earlier at night, not against thieves or vagabonds, but against the quiet terror that lived in their midst. The Miller sisters had transformed from women into a specter, a reminder that evil does not always come in the form of outlaws or strangers. Sometimes it comes in the form of neighbors, bound by blood, hidden behind shutters, and protected by the silence of an entire community. The arrival of the sisters in Lancaster County marked more than just the settling of another family in a quiet farming community. It marked the planting of something deeply unsettling, though no one at the time could see it coming. The year was 1837, and the county itself was a place that appeared suspended in pastoral calm. Rolling fields stretched toward the horizon, barns stood proud in their red-painted simplicity, and church bells punctuated the weeks with a rhythm that people clung to as though it could keep chaos away. But beneath that facade of rural order, tension lived quietly. The economy was shifting. Families who had once controlled their land for generations were now struggling to maintain it, and whispers of moral decay drifted through taverns, kitchens, and church pews. The four sisters arrived into this climate like sparks into dry grass, and no one realized how quickly things would ignite. Their names traveled quietly at first, murmured among curious neighbors who noticed how strangely independent they carried themselves. They did not arrive with husbands, nor with fathers, nor with any visible guardians of male authority, which was itself a spectacle in a society that demanded women to exist beneath the shadow of men. Instead, the sisters walked into Lancaster with their heads unbowed, their eyes set forward, and their mouths curiously tight. It is said they rented a small property near a wooded stretch of road, close enough to the village to be seen but far enough to remain mysterious. From the beginning, locals remarked on how they seemed to prefer one another's company above all others, as though the world outside their circle was not to be trusted. Isolation fed the fire of speculation. Neighbors claimed they saw candles burning in their windows late into the night, shadows moving across thin curtains as if some ritual was taking place behind closed doors. The sounds of hushed arguments followed by sudden laughter floated across the fields. Children whispered that the sisters spoke in unison when addressed, that they carried baskets not of bread or sewing, but heavy with objects no one could see. Even those who dismissed such tales admitted there was something unsettling in how the sisters moved as a unit, each seeming to anticipate the other's actions without words. In a time where individuality was tempered by duty, they embodied something sharper, as though they carried a private law unknown to anyone else. Still, Lancaster was a practical place, and people tried to fold the sisters into normal patterns of life. The church invited them, the neighbors offered assistance, farmers' wives extended welcomes, and yet each effort was met with the same polite but distant refusals. The sisters were not hostile, but their distance bred unease. Soon, small frictions began to surface. A farmer accused them of taking chickens without paying. A storekeeper swore they had stolen a bolt of fabric, though he could not prove it. When a boy claimed to have seen them dragging something heavy into the woods, his story was dismissed as a child's fancy. But the unease only deepened. The sisters, it seemed, brought with them not just strangeness, but the subtle corrosion of trust. In such a close-knit community, the presence of outsiders who lived by their own rules was threatening enough, but what followed ensured their names would be etched into Lancaster's whispered history. Strange misfortunes began to ripple outward. A barn caught fire on a windless night, its orange glow staining the sky for miles. Livestock sickened suddenly and died, though no cause could be found. One of the town's elders, a man who had voiced strong disapproval of the sisters, was discovered unconscious by the roadside, beaten so badly he could never again speak clearly. While none of these calamities could be traced directly to the sisters, the coincidences were too heavy to ignore. And with every misfortune, the sense of dread around them thickened. What unnerved the townsfolk most was how the sisters seemed untouched by it all. While others wept over losses or fumed in anger, they moved about with a calm detachment that seemed almost rehearsed. Their eyes were steady, their hands never trembled, and they spoke only when necessary. Rumors swelled into darker shapes. Some said they had brought curses from the old country, that they carried knowledge no good Christian should possess. Others insisted they were simply clever manipulators, women who used their unity and charm to exploit weaknesses in a community that was far too trusting. The truth, as always, hovered between superstition and reality, and in that space, terror took root. The more the community pressed against them, the more tightly the sisters seemed to coil together, as if resisting a force that might break them apart. Their unity was both their shield and their weapon. To speak to one was to speak to all, and to cross one was to risk offending the collective. It was said they could glance across a crowded room and know instantly what the other was thinking. Such intimacy unsettled those who lived within rigid hierarchies of control. Husbands commanding wives, fathers ruling daughters. Here were four women with no visible chain, no submission, no fear of men, and in that defiance was a kind of violence all its own. Eventually, suspicion curdled into open hostility. A town meeting was held, cloaked in the language of law and order, But its true intent was clear. Something had to be done about the sisters. Yet, even as accusations flew, witchcraft, theft, seduction, conspiracy, no one could pin down a crime that held weight in court. Facts dissolved into rumor, and rumor took on the sharpness of truth. The sisters, it seemed, had become both scapegoats and predators, feeding on the community's fears while fueling them in equal measure. The town was caught in a bind. It could not prove their guilt, but it could not forget their presence either. Then, the inevitable escalations occurred, events that would later be tied unmistakably to the sisters, whether through evidence or whispered testimony. Bodies were found in shallow graves near the woods where they lived. Men who had pursued them, some out of lust, others out of suspicion, vanished without trace. And when a local sheriff finally gathered the courage to confront them, it was said he left their house pale, shaken, and unable to speak of what he had seen inside. The line between rumor and horror had blurred beyond distinction, and the community, once merely uneasy, now lived in outright fear. The sisters had crossed from mysterious outsiders into figures of legend, and not the kind Lancaster's people wanted to tell their children. The pastoral calm of 1837 was shattered, not by war, not by famine, but by four women who carried within them a force as dark as it was irresistible. Whether they were witches, murderers, or simply victims of collective hysteria no longer mattered. In the eyes of Lancaster County, they had become killers, not of bodies alone, but of peace, of order, of the fragile trust that bound a rural community together. And once that trust was broken, there was no mending it. By the time whispers turned into shouts and suspicion became certainty, the county of Lancaster was no longer the same place it had been before the sisters arrived. Where once there had been quiet evenings filled with the sound of fiddles and hymns, there was now tension so thick it clung to every gathering like smoke. Markets that had once bustled with trade became forums for gossip. Farmers who had once greeted each other with nods and shared labor now eyed one another with mistrust, each wondering who might side with the sisters and who might move against them. The air itself seemed to carry unease, and no one could deny that the epicenter of this disruption was the four women living together at the edge of the woods. The first real spark of panic began with an argument in the village square. A man who had lost two sons in strange accidents accused the sisters directly, claiming they had cursed his family. He stood shaking with rage, spitting accusations while neighbors gathered to listen. The sisters were not present, yet their absence made the moment feel even more dangerous. Some people nodded in agreement. Others looked down at their shoes, unwilling to meet the man's eyes. Fear and anger had finally crossed the threshold into open speech. But what made the moment terrifying was not his accusations. It was how quickly others began adding their own. A farmer's wife spoke of bread that spoiled within hours of being baked. Another man recounted how his cattle had grown sick after the sisters passed his property. Even small inconveniences, broken tools, quarrels at home, sudden fevers, were tied to the sisters with a logic built not from evidence but from fear. Once people began speaking openly, the momentum was impossible to stop. Lancaster was a place where appearances mattered, where reputation was currency. To be associated with misfortune or danger risked social exile, and so even those who had once defended the sisters began distancing themselves. Some who had been friendly to them quietly locked their doors, while others who had traded with them refused to sell goods any longer. This withdrawal did not go unnoticed. The sisters, who had always carried themselves with eerie composure, began appearing in public even less. Their windows, once lit late into the night, grew dark for longer stretches of time, as though they too felt the tightening noose of community suspicion. But the silence they retreated into only fanned the flames of paranoia. Absence became proof of guilt. If the sisters were not attending church, surely it meant they worshipped something darker. If they were not at market, surely it was because they had stolen enough to sustain themselves. Each rumor was a spark, and the county seemed ready to ignite. At taverns, men muttered that the sisters were no longer merely suspicious, they were dangerous. Some said they were murderers hiding evidence in the woods. Others insisted they were seductresses who lured men into their home and ensnared them, body and soul. A few whispered that they were not even fully human, but creatures cloaked in flesh, sent to test the faithful. Into this climate came the discovery that shifted everything. One morning, a body was found in a shallow ditch near the sisters' property. It belonged to a young man, scarcely more than 20, who had last been seen leaving the tavern days earlier. His face was bruised, his hands torn, as though he had fought against something or someone before he died. The shock that rippled through the community was immediate and fierce. For the first time, death had a physical shape tied to the fears already swelling in Lancaster. Though there was no proof the sisters had anything to do with it, no one in the county believed otherwise. To them, this was confirmation, not coincidence. The sheriff tried to maintain order, urging restraint, but he was a single man against the rising tide of collective fear. Even his deputies whispered their own doubts, and soon he found himself pressured to take action he was not certain was just. The sisters' home became the subject of constant surveillance. Neighbors swore they saw men enter and never come out. Others claimed they heard cries in the night, muffled and sharp. The woods near their property, once a place children played, grew avoided, as though crossing too near would invite calamity. Fear had warped into something more primal, and Lancaster County began to resemble not a community of farmers and families, but a village haunted by a living curse. As weeks passed, panic grew into organized hostility. Meetings were called not to discuss whether the sisters were guilty, but how to act against them. Some urged caution, fearing divine punishment if innocent blood was spilled. Others argued that failing to act would doom them all. The louder voices drowned out the cautious ones, and soon Lancaster spoke with one tongue. Something had to be done. Yet behind their righteous anger lurked the truth. What people wanted was not justice, but the relief of their own terror. They wanted to see the sisters punished because it would restore order, silence the unease, and offer an illusion of control over the darkness that had crept into their lives. The sisters themselves became specters in this growing storm. They no longer ventured into town. When glimpsed from a distance, they walked closely together, faces unreadable, eyes that met no one's. Some swore they looked thinner, as though their own isolation had begun to consume them. Others claimed they looked stronger, more defiant, as though feeding on the fear itself. Every description fed the narrative, each one contradictory but equally believed. The sisters were no longer women in the eyes of Lancaster County. They were symbols, vessels of whatever darkness the townsfolk needed them to carry. By the time another body was found, this one buried in a shallow grave deeper in the woods, panic had hardened into fury. No one cared that the evidence remained circumstantial. No one cared that the line between rumor and fact had all but vanished. The truth had ceased to matter. What mattered was the story the county had built around the sisters, a story of women who had stepped beyond the bounds of their roles, who had defied the laws of men and God, and who must therefore be destroyed. Panic had achieved what reason never could. It had forged unity, but unity in rage, not peace. Lancaster County stood at the edge of something irreversible. Every whispered tale, every unexplained misfortune, every fearful glance had built toward this moment. What began as suspicion had swelled into paranoia, and paranoia had ripened into a hunger for punishment. The sisters, once merely strange outsiders, were now marked in the minds of their neighbors as killers. And though no one could see it fully yet, the path ahead was already written. The county had chosen its villains, and it would not rest until they were made to pay. The downfall of the four sisters was not a single event, but a slow, crushing inevitability, like a storm that gathers for weeks before finally breaking across the land. By the time Lancaster County reached its fever pitch of suspicion and rage, the sisters had already been condemned in the eyes of their neighbors. What remained was not a question of innocence or guilt, but of how swiftly and how brutally the sentence would be carried out. People no longer asked if the sisters had committed crimes. They asked how many, how often, and how much longer the county could endure their presence. The sheriff, worn down by weeks of sleepless nights, restless meetings, and the constant weight of public demand, finally bowed to pressure. Though he lacked clear evidence, he could not ignore the fury of the community that saw itself as judge and jury. Deputies were sent to the sisters' home, their boots heavy on the dirt road, rifles slung over their shoulders more for show than law. Neighbors followed behind in a grim procession, eager to witness the moment when fear would at last be answered with action. The house, standing at the edge of the woods, looked as it always had, plain, wooden, silent. Yet on that day it seemed transformed, as though the very boards absorbed the weight of the county's hatred. When the door was forced open, the sisters were found inside, calm as ever, seated together at a table where no meal had been set. Their hands were folded, their eyes watchful but not afraid. Witnesses later swore that none of them flinched when the deputies stormed the room. They rose in unison as though anticipating the intrusion, as though they had been waiting for it all along. The arrest itself was quiet, almost anticlimactic. No screams, no struggle, no pleas. The sisters allowed their wrists to be bound, allowed themselves to be led out into the sunlight where the crowd waited. What unnerved the onlookers was not resistance, but composure. One woman later said it was as if the sisters pitied the crowd, as though Lancaster's rage was smaller than the silence the sisters carried within themselves. That silence, that refusal to panic, cut deeper than any words could have. They were placed in the county jail, a small stone building not designed to hold legends or monsters, but ordinary thieves and drunkards. Yet their presence transformed it into something else entirely. Crowds gathered outside day and night, some to curse them, some to stare in fascination, some to whisper prayers of protection against their supposed powers. Stories grew wild in their confinement. Some claimed the sisters could make chains fall away with a mere glance. Others said they had confessed in secret to dozens of murders. Still others insisted they had bewitched the sheriff himself, which explained why they remained alive at all. The line between fact and fabrication dissolved completely, and Lancaster County fed on its own imagination like a starving beast. The trial was swift, if it could be called that. The courtroom was filled to bursting, the air thick with sweat and anticipation. Witness after witness came forward, not with evidence but with stories. Livestock gone missing, strange illnesses, unexplained fires, whispers of curses and shadows in the woods. The young man's body found near their property became the centerpiece of accusation, though no proof tied the sisters to his death. What mattered was the story that had already hardened in the minds of the jurors. 4 women, living outside the rules of men, had invited darkness into Lancaster. Whether by witchcraft, conspiracy, or sheer defiance, they had broken the fragile peace, and for that, they had to answer. The sisters did not speak much during the proceedings. When they did, their voices were steady, measured, never defensive. One of them asked why the county had waited so long to act if they truly believed her guilty. Another asked what proof had been laid before the court beyond fear and rumor. But reason had no foothold in that room. Each calm question only deepened the audience's unease. To many, their composure was not innocence but arrogance, the final insult of women who would not bow. The verdict was sealed long before the jury delivered it. Guilty, the sentence was death. Not exile, not imprisonment, but the ultimate removal, demanded as much by the crowd outside as by the men seated in judgment. The sheriff, pale and unsteady, delivered the ruling in a voice that cracked. Some said he feared the sisters, others said he feared the wrath of the people if he did not condemn them. Whatever the truth, Lancaster had spoken, and the sisters' fate was set. The execution drew hundreds, perhaps more than the county had ever gathered for any other event. Families came with children, merchants closed their shops, and farmers left fields untended, all to see the spectacle. It was not justice they sought, but catharsis, a purging of fear. The sisters were led to the scaffold, dressed in plain garments, their hair bound. Witnesses later swore they walked without hesitation, their steps synchronized, their faces unreadable. Some said they looked serene, others said they looked defiant. But no one could deny they carried themselves with an eerie unity that unsettled even in their final hour. As the nooses were placed around their necks, one of the sisters finally spoke. Her words were not loud, but those close enough to hear remembered them for years. It is not us you kill, but yourselves. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some dismissed it as madness, others as blasphemy, but the phrase lodged itself in the memory of Lancaster County like a curse. Moments later, the platform dropped, and the 4 women who had terrified a community hung suspended, their stillness bringing both relief and unease. The county celebrated afterward, though uneasily. Bells rang, taverns filled, prayers were offered in thanksgiving. Yet beneath the surface of relief was something colder. Livestock still died unexpectedly. Fires still broke out without explanation. Families still quarreled. Accidents still claimed lives. Crops still failed in harsh seasons. The removal of the sisters had not erased misfortune. It had only given it a human face to blame. And in quiet moments, when the county lay under starlight, some wondered whether Lancaster had destroyed its villains or created them. The house by the woods was abandoned, left to rot. Children dared each other to approach it, swearing they could hear whispers inside. Travelers passing through were told the tale of the four sisters, each storyteller adding their own detail, their own embellishment, until truth was buried beneath layers of legend. For some, the story was a warning against outsiders, against women who lived without men, against those who broke the rules of community. For others, it was a story of hysteria, a reminder of how quickly fear could devour reason. Yet the sisters themselves remained an enigma, even in death. Were they truly guilty of murder, or had Lancaster simply needed them to be? Did they embody evil, or did the county project its darkest fears onto them? No records could answer these questions fully. No testimony could settle the doubt. All that remained was the memory of four women who had unsettled an entire community, and the chilling certainty that once fear takes root, it does not need proof to demand blood. Lancaster County never forgot them. Their names faded, their faces were lost to time, but their story lingered like a shadow, retold around firesides and in hushed tones for generations. And always, at the heart of the story, was the image of four sisters walking together, calm and unbroken, into the jaws of judgment. If you've made it this far into this dark journey, you already know that what we uncover here isn't just history. It's the hidden chapters no one wanted you to remember. Stories like the Four Sisters of Lancaster County remind us that truth is often stranger, darker, and more disturbing than fiction. And the deeper we dig, the more we realize how much of the past was buried, not because it was forgotten, but because it was too uncomfortable, too dangerous, or too damning to leave in plain sight. If these forgotten crimes, forbidden histories, and unsettling mysteries kept you hooked tonight, then this is only the beginning. Every week we peel back another layer of shadowed history, tragedies that were silenced, secrets that were forced underground, and voices that were erased. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just watch, become part of this exploration. Hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you never miss a single story. Because each new episode isn't just a tale, it's a key, unlocking something that was never meant to be seen again. And I want to hear from you. Do you believe the four sisters were true killers, or were they scapegoats consumed by the paranoia of their community? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective fuels these discussions and keeps the dark history alive. Subscribe now, join this growing community of truth seekers, and step with us into the shadows of the past, where every story leaves a question you'll carry long after the video ends.